So good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. Is change management in a project environment. So as I mentioned, this is presented by the Enabling Change SIG. Our aim as a community is to improve the change capabilities of organisations, teams and individuals. And both Mark and I have been members of the Enabling Change SIG now for the last couple of years. Okay, Mark, do you want to introduce yourself?
I will indeed. So my name's Mark Vincent and I've been involved in change and transformation now for about 25 years. Yes, I know, it's a shocker, isn't it? And part of that is included, or a big part of that was in the music and media sector through a period of incredibly rapid transformation and change as a result of digitisation from the period from about sort of 2001 till 2010. It's still changing now as it happens, but so during that period, as you can imagine, there was a lot of interesting times and a lot of resistance as well. I'm now owner of Applied Change, and at Applied Change we supply engagement tools and resources for change leaders and project managers who are going through change, especially where the resistance to change is high, which you may have noticed if you're involved in projects at the moment. That can be true on occasion. And of course is what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So that's me. Back to you then, David.
Hi, and yeah, my name's Dave Appleyard. My background has been very much in oil and gas exploration with a recent foray into consulting, and I'm currently a chartered project management professional and a senior principal consultant with MIGSO PQ'd. A lot of my change management experience has come around mergers, acquisitions and divestments, but that has been basically over around the last 25 years as well. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to walk you through, what does change management do in a project environment and why is it important? We're then going to look at how change makes you feel as an individual. We're then going to look at considerations when change is done unto you as a recipient of change, and then finish off with considerations that you may want to have when you're actually leading change initiatives in projects. And finally, we pull this all together with just a few concluding remarks. In a simple way, change management is about winning the hearts and minds of people and to help them in a project environment by moving from a fixed, as is today state through a period of change and into a future state. And to do that, we want to engage with stakeholders. We want to minimize any sort of risk that we have into adoption of the solution that we're deploying. And we need to align the organizational resources towards the strategic change, the vision for the future, in order to give that the best possible chance of success moving forwards. Now, my little image here is almost a bit like a Prussian army, but we don't need to do that, but they do need to be broadly aligned in the way in which we're going. The only problem we've got with this is that unfortunately, many organizations and many projects don't really fully understand the value of change management and don't take that on heart. And what that tends to lead to is missing benefits, less success, less achievement of the objectives of the project, and in many cases not actually achieving the objective at all. So hopefully we're going to talk about a few of those areas over the next 45 minutes. So why is it important? Well, the world's becoming more volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and projects, if you're involved in the project management world, are becoming ever more complicated, intense and political. Now, on the bottom left, what I'm trying to say here is that, and this is based on Lewin's model of freeze, unfreeze, refreeze, but essentially, if you don't have change management, transformation tends to take longer than it would with it. The future state that you reach at the end of your transformation or at the end of your project tends to have holes or little areas of lower adoption and ultimately deliver lower benefits. If we apply change management, We tend to be quicker. We tend to deliver benefits earlier than we otherwise would, which is of great value to any organization. And the ultimate solution tends to be more complete, with less pockets of resistance, less pockets of low adoption, and ultimately greater benefits. But there's a caveat to this. And I'd just like you to reflect on the quotes from Gartner and McKinsey at the bottom right of this slide. They're interesting quotes, aren't they? Because ultimately what they're saying is that we need to do better. That, you know, in the current situation, although we say in change management we need to get people involved, and leaders say they're getting people involved, only 42% of employees feel truly involved in those change initiatives. And unless we get that 42% of employees up and more people get involved, projects will continue to fail, continue to realize less benefits than they should, and adoption is less likely to stick. And here's the kicker. If you look at the bottom quote from Gartner, because the world is getting more complicated, what we see now is that there is a reduction in the number of percentage of employees who now feel committed to change, and that is dropping continuously as we move forwards. So we're actually getting more resistance to change than we ever have in the past. And that's going to be a challenge for both project managers and change managers moving forwards. And before I hand over to Mark, I just wanted to cover off, there are some results from a recent ProSci survey, and ProSci are one of the world leaders in change management. And what you see on this slide is 3 graphs that basically all show more or less the same thing, that if you have better project management, your chances of reaching your project objectives go up significantly from 16% to 96%. Your chance of meeting your schedule is improved from 16 to 72%. And your chance of your project coming in on budget increases to a lesser extent from 48% to 81%. Now, you know, it's probably unrealistic on many of our projects to think that we could suddenly go from 16% ability to achieve objectives up to 96%. But even if you look at just that improvement from 46 to 77, highlighted by the middle 2 bars, that is still doubling your chance of coming out and meeting your objectives. So, you know, the point here is really change management can really deliver better benefits into your projects. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Mark.
Thank you, David. Some great points already. What I'd also like to do, what we'd like to do now, is to just go a little bit deeper into that and explore what's behind it. And to do that, I'd like to go with a little thought experiment for a moment, if that's okay. So consider, maybe close your eyes, because this is a little bit easier if you shut your eyes. So shut your eyes and consider for a minute a situation in which you've had to change. In other words, you've been forced to change, and not something you've chosen, but you've had to do for reasons that are outside of your control. So think of an example and just imagine yourself back there now when it was first announced, when you first found out about it. How did you feel? So think about your, you know, what could you see? What could you hear? What could you feel? What was going on? Yeah, just give that a moment and imagine you're there now. See what you see what you saw, hear what you heard, and feel what you felt. Yeah. So thank you. Someone's done that already. Thank you very much, Mary. So maybe pop in the chat what your emotions, what kind of emotions were showing up for you. Oh, we've had 2 of the same. Anything else? Yeah. Excellent. So one of the things I'm not seeing at the moment are any positive emotions. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Some great ones. Yeah, a lot of themes showing up here. So uncertain, anger, curious. That's an interesting one. Yes. Stressed, frustrated. Great. Okay, let's do the same again. But now think of something that you. I think we can hold it there. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. I love that. This is super enthusiastic. Great start. So let's now think of it. Do the same again. and think of a situation where you're looking forward, you're doing something that really motivates you, something that you're really passionate about, that you really want. Yeah. Now think about that for a minute. Yeah. Again.
No, I can't hear anything.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Whole different set of emotions, right? Excellent. I think we get the point. So we just hold it there. So thank you everyone for such a great participation. What I'd like to just get to reflect on for a second is the difference. Okay. Now, when you're handling this right, what we're actually looking for here is exactly what we've been pointing to. That sort of taking people from a place of fear, anger, suspicion, and all of the sort of negative emotions that come with it, and edging them towards something a lot more positive, a lot more energized. Yeah. So I think without dwelling too much on this, these positive emotions tend to drive us forward. They tend to make us get involved in something. The negative ones tend to do the opposite. We tend to slow down. We tend to resist. Okay. And the aim of change management, and what we're pointing at here, of course, is to do far more of the second one, or encourage people to do far more of be far more engaged through those positive emotions, and far less disengaged through the negative ones. And that is essentially at the core what change management is about. And the other thing really to make, when we're in a change scenario, this is happening to each and every person involved in your change. So if you're leading the change, well worth keeping that front of mind. Okay, so let's quickly move on. So the next one is in the 1960s, psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross spent a lot of time working closely with the dying and bereaved, and she noticed that there's a grieving process that happens to all of us. In fact, we tend to follow a pattern, if you like, of emotions, as outlined in this graph here. And later, later it was also observed that change follows the same pattern. And so when a change is forced on people, essentially in different ways, different speeds, they go through a very similar process. And what's also noted is that when people are in that sort of downward set from, shock, denial, frustration, depression, these are the emotions that we were just talking about earlier. Okay. And so our job as change leaders is to support people through that downward process, okay, to help them to come to terms with it in their own way, because of course we can't force them to do that. What we can do is give them the conditions that encourage them to, and to give them the support and the help and the emotional support as well that gets them through that bottom half of the curve into the more positive emotions, which are acceptance and then figuring out how to make it best for them. And again, back to the point earlier, it's always personal, it's always individual. So the next slide really points at something I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And why have we put that up? Well, it's worth reminding ourselves that this is at play, and that people fundamentally will be protecting their basic needs, which are foundational. So looking to the bottom of the pyramid, safety and physiological needs are fundamentally driving the core of our behaviors. And if they are not met, then we have no chance of accessing the higher needs. So if we're worried about our safety needs, then we won't be anywhere near the esteem needs or self-actualization needs. And Google ran a study called Rework, and it involved about 180 teams and a mixture of engineering and sales, mix of high and low performing teams. And because they wanted to understand really what makes a great team. Why is it that certain teams perform well and others less well? So they did this big study, and as most of you know, I'm sure that Google put a lot of emphasis in this. And what they found from the study was that there were 5 kind of characteristics that come through. And those were psychological safety, dependability, structure and clarity, and meaning, and then impact. And if you look at those results, psychological safety by far was one of the biggest and most fundamental factors that if it exists in any team scenario, and by definition any change scenario, then everything slows down and none of the other things will happen. So it's one of the most fundamental. Yeah, so basically the key to take away here is psychological safety is foundational, and helping people to feel safe through change is therefore one of the primary functions of change management. Security, there you go, to make the point even stronger. As we go through with something new, whether we've chosen it or not, there is a cycle. Many of you may be familiar with this. And the great analogy here, of course, is learning to drive a car for the first time. So I'm going to start at the bottom of the curve here, if in the car analogy. So when we start to drive a car, we know we can't drive a car, so we are consciously incompetent. And as we learn to drive, we become we become able, but we're still focusing on what we're doing with the pedals, the gear stick. We're looking at the speedo, we're looking at the road, and we get to that point where most of us are now. And I'm going to caveat that, which is that we drive without thinking about it. And this is that process where we get from A to B, and actually we have no idea about that journey at all because we've been deep in thought doing something else. And that's essentially what's happened here. Is the brain has switched over from system 1 to system 2, and we are effectively running on autopilot. And the key important thing for change, of course, is that when we change something, we have to allow people that period of time to go through to learn something new, like driving a car, and we will be less competent at it initially, and therefore we will be slower at it. And it's a common mistake that I see where not enough time has been allowed in that. In fact, I had a great example of what this looks like with a customer service team a few years back, where they'd taken on a new system, and even though the system was better, they hated it with an absolute passion. And by association, they also hated me and my colleague. And they took it on, they went with it, but they weren't a fan at all because they'd worked with the other system for 20 years. Anyway, we met them again 6 months later on some other project, and it was really interesting, the turnaround. Having had 6 months using this thing, they were the polar opposite. They were rubbishing the old system. They loved the new, and Martin and I were like some long lost friends, and the whole relationship. And all that had happened is they'd had time to settle in, get used to it, get used to all the shortcuts, and actually make it work for them, which it now did, of course. So it's a really key one with change, is to allow people to take the time really for themselves to get through in their own way, and to allow for that. And it's a common mistake that change projects, the old what they call it, drop and run, where the change lands, and then everyone disappears, and those who are involved are left to find their way through the new systems, processes, or whatever's changed. So well worth keeping in mind. Okay, I think I'm back to you now, David, looking at the colour.
You are. You know, I once heard somebody sort of say that the only people who like change are wet babies. But, you know, there's some people in the chat who obviously seem quite positive about it. Okay, so we're now going to move on to some tips around changes where, you know, you're the driving force. You know, you're delivering a change that you want to put into an organisation. And, you know, a good place to start here is, you know, understanding the organisation that you're trying to put the change into. So can people think about this for a couple of minutes and just put into the chat, you know, reasons why we may need to understand the organisation, what we might want to find out from the organisation that we're embedding change into. You can put things into the chat when you're ready. Yep. How much change has there been already? Change fatigue plays a big part. Yep. Appetite for change, certainly. The culture is a good one. What's a strategy? Absolutely. the objectives, political environment, motivation. Yep. I like the why there. We're going to come to that next. Great. Thank you for that. That's really, really good. A couple that I'd just like to pick out that we've not necessarily picked up there is the culture we got. Sponsorship and leadership of change is really, really important, and to make sure that you've got the right leadership supporting this, that you've got the right people giving the right communication messages. So that's a really key one. Another one I've not seen come up there, people and stakeholders is good, is conflicting priorities, conflicting projects, all of which have an implication on your ability to deliver your changes. And one that I ran into a couple of years ago, which I hadn't really expected so much, was around the training culture of the organisation. And I worked with a company in France for a couple of years, where the whole culture around training was that they only allowed 10-minute bite-sized training courses. So, any plans that we might have had as part of a global deployment to have classroom training, 1 hour plus sessions, just immediately went out of the window. But there's several things that you've caught here that you need to consider before you even start your training or your change program. So some very, very good thoughts there. And one other point before I move on, we had a seminar last year where we talked about change readiness, and that's something that is certainly worth assessing as part of this phase when you first move into an organization, to understand the culture, understand the readiness for going through this change, and to understand the readiness for the leadership and the executive team to be able to take the findings back from that change readiness assessment and actually act upon that. Now, somebody, when I said, what do you need to know about the organization, said, why? And it's a really good one, because why is exactly the first question that we should be asking about any change initiative. And that's something that as a project manager and as a change professional that we really need to understand. And the reason for that is because if you reflect back to the Kubler-Ross change curve that Mark showed earlier, when you're going through that initial decline and that initial slope down from denial into the valley of tears at the bottom, the question that you're going to be asked by the people in the organization, by those going through this, is, why is this happening to me? Why are we doing this? And as a change leader, you've got to be able to give that answer. So understanding the why is absolutely crucial. Once you get to that bottom of the change curve and you start going up the other side, if you look at this very carefully, you will see that why, the question that is coming from the audience, begins to change from why to more to how, and how can we help and how can we support this change? So the types of questions that you get as you're going through these are very important and certainly worth listening to. The other reason to understand the why is because that actually factors into the benefits or into the vision that you need to create. I'd just like to talk a little bit around vision, because one of the things that once you've got that why, and once you understand why it's happening, and there could be several reasons, you could have a range of different drivers. These could be internal drivers. You've developed a new piece of technology. You've got new rules. They could be external drivers such as regulation, such as new technology coming onto the market, etc. Understanding those drivers and mapping those out, and understanding the reasons why we need this project enable you then to formulate the vision. And formulating a vision and having that clearly communicated amongst your stakeholder group, initially to a core group of close allies, close supporters, close cohort, and getting their agreement to a compelling vision for change, and then gradually expanding that out to a wider stakeholder group as it's bought into and as it's communicated, is absolutely clear to give that, that coalition that are supporting the change a direction in which you're trying to go. So we're back on vision. So what goes into a vision? There's very, very many different views about what goes into a vision, and I've had many discussions over the years with different colleagues about the depth that any vision needs to have. But essentially it comes down to three things. As part of that vision, you need to have something in there around the people and how they will contribute to that, work together and deliver the change. There needs to be an aspect related to the processes and how those processes will be delivered and how the results will be measured. And there needs to be an area around technology and the way in which it's deployed. But quite often I see organizations who, when they put together a vision, essentially it's a branding slogan. And I think it needs to be a bit deeper than that.
So you'll probably hear a lot about the winning the hearts and minds. I know I have over 25 years. But as we looked at earlier on one of the slides that David showed right at the beginning, we're not doing as great a job at it as we'd like to think. And sort of pointing back to the slide on vision, the key thing, of course, is to recognise that and think about changes you're doing for yourself, in your own world, whether it's writing a book, spending more time with the kids, losing weight, whatever it is. There's a whole world of difference between understanding the reason to change and then wanting it enough to make it happen. And so it's really important to kind of recognize that. It's one thing to say the change makes sense and that people kind of get it. It's a good answer for the organization. It's quite another thing to present and deliver that change in a way that people really feel energized and want it, basically pulling on all those emotions that we were all excitedly putting out earlier when it's a change that we want. It's not an easy thing to do. I'm not going to suggest for a minute it is, but actually understanding that without emotionally connecting with people, essentially what happens is you have no real fuel to work with. And another thing in all of this is to recognize, I suppose, the difference between, if you like, the rational side and the emotional side. There's some great metaphors out there. Chip and Dan Heath have a great one, which I love, a book called Switch, which I highly recommend. If that's the only book you ever read on change, I'd say that's a great one to start with. Elephant and rider is what the analogy they use, and the idea being that for those of you who've seen a mammoth on an elephant in Nepal or similar countries, you've got this tiny little chap sat on top of a great big elephant. I've just been asked about the book is called Switch, How to Make Change When Change is Hard. I'll put it in the chat later. And it uses an analogy of an elephant and a rider, with the elephant representing our emotional side, and the little fella sat on top representing our rational brain, our rational side. And the proportion is about right, because the elephant, if it decides it's going to go left, it doesn't actually matter what the guy on top thinks, it's going left. And so that's just what actually ends up happening with us, right? If our emotions are telling us one thing and our rational brain is telling us something else, it's far more likely that we're going to follow our emotions and not our rational thinking. If that weren't true, then we wouldn't have the diet industry the size that it is today, despite having probably one of the lowest success rates of anything, given the amount of money that we all spend on it. It's a reality of life and very important when it comes to change. So don't underestimate, is the short answer to this, the emotional importance. So if there are negative emotions or positive emotions, they will be driving those behaviors, regardless of whether the change makes rational sense or not. So the message here is pay attention. And I think then there's, beyond sort of the rational articulation of change, it's really getting everyone to a place where they are ready to engage in it. And remember, up until we get some kind of some movement, if you like, and some reason that goes beyond the sort of standard rational reason to get involved, everyone's sitting in their own world, and in their own world, they're most likely comfortable. And so to some extent, we have to, create a situation where, on the one hand, they're feeling driven towards some, utopian point of light in the distance that they feel they can get towards. And on the other hand, we need to make them feel a little less comfortable with where they are today, because comfort does a great job of actually keeping us exactly where we are now. And it's another important one to remember. Why have I not referenced Kotter's change model? There are lots of change models that are very similar. So what we're talking about here is the early stages of Kotter. So the first 3 steps mainly, which is where we're trying to create that motivation, that sort of drive for change. There's not only Kotter, we've got Adkar and various others, all pointing in very similar directions. In fact, Lewin's force field analysis talks about forward forces and restraining forces. Similarly, forward forces being those emotive desires, if you like, to move forward. The desire a lot of people have in January to get fitter and healthier. And then you've got the restraining forces, which are all those things stopping us getting fitter and healthier, such as the busy work life, being invited to a cocktail party about the 3rd week of January, and all the other stuff that we know goes with it. So remember that everyone's sitting in their own world, they're comfortable. And so the change, the way it's presented and the way it's delivered, needs to do 2 things. One is to get people in a state where they're ready and willing to put the effort involved to make change happen. And on the other hand, is to address those reasons why they may not. And the reason for the adoption curve here is you will find that in any change situation, you'll get people, generally speaking, that will get involved early on, and they will be ready. They'll be more curious, more amenable to trying something new. Those are the early adopters. This is what Kotter talks about, which is creating the sort of the guiding coalition, if you like, those people who are already in. They don't take much convincing. You've got, followed by that, you've got obviously the early adopters. So you've got the innovators, sorry, is the first group. You've got the early adopters is the second group. And they're generally those who, once they see that this thing is likely to work, they're going to get on board fairly quickly. And then you've got the early majority who will follow soon after. You'll find that there are some people, and my experience over 25 years is there are some people who will always drag their heels right to the end. The job of a change leader, of course, is to get enough critical mass such that they're, so that the change happens in a good way, minimizing the emotional damage, if you like, to those who feel dragged along, as we've talked about in the change curve. So again, in understanding those internal forces that are driving the change within each and every person involved helps to guide the way in which change leaders communicate and really then also the way they deliver the change in a way that is easier, I suppose, for everyone involved in it. And I think the way talking takes us nicely onto communication and the way we communicate change. One of the things to watch out for, something that I've seen a lot, is this sort of tendency to use a lot of town hall broadcast style communication and then think you're done. To quote George Bernard Shaw, the biggest trouble with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. It's very easy to kid ourselves that we've done a great job of communicating, only to find that everybody's left feeling confused, concerned, worried about what wasn't said, because we do a great job of filling in the gaps. So keep that in mind. And also another caution with communication is to ensure that the way in which we push information out, or the way we share information, is appropriate to the different audiences. A common mistake I see is where the method of communication we use is so frequent, so overwhelming, that people can't actually get to the few pieces of information that they actually want, which mostly relates to what their situation will be for them personally. So be careful. On the one hand, we need to communicate hard the why and communicate in a way that actually gets people to engage with the change. But on the other hand, what we don't want to do is to overwhelm people with too much irrelevant information that doesn't relate to them. So communication strategy needs to take that into account. And remember how we receive information as well. You know, some people prefer to receive information visually, some people auditory sound, and then kinesthetically, which is more sort of physically based. So we're now learning about that in schools, and the way kids learn, we're no different as adults. So the way we present, just relying on things like email and video presentations, vary it up a little bit and try and engage the different types of people. And stories, finally, are a great way as well of getting change across. We identify really well with stories. So in communication, use a mix of the different methods of delivery, as I said, and then also, you know, tell stories and and engage people that way. But remember, communication is also a two-way process. And a common mistake is to use a sort of a one-way, single-directional form of communication. Get people involved, get feedback, understand how people feel, and use that information to then shape future communications, such that it feels more like a conversation than a broadcast. That's a very quick through communication, David.
Okay, yeah, one point we do need to cover off is measuring success. In that, definitely agree with plain language. We're getting a lot more communication comments coming back. But measuring success is also essential, not only for the change team to understand how well they performed as a change team, but also to look at how the change has been delivered into the organisation and the success in terms of adoption. So when we start measuring, there's several different factors that you need to look at in different areas of that change. And so it's overall change management, looking at the project and also looking at the adoption levels on that. So if we want to learn any more about change management, I would certainly recommend the Introduction to Change Management that is published by the APM and is available on their website. This is primarily for project professionals working in a change management environment, and it will help raise awareness of the language and concepts involved. If you want to get involved more in change management, I just wanted to draw your attention to this. This is a change management profession horizons map that documents the different courses that are available through the APM at different levels or different times in your change management career, just to give you an indication of the roadmap or the training journey that you may be going on. It's certainly worth having a look at in a bit more detail if you're interested in the future in change management. Conclusions. Mark, do you want to start? And then we'll hand over questions.
Without beating on again about it, it is all about people. In the end, change is a largely human process. And you know, keep in mind that we need a reason, okay, and that's what the vision is all about, is giving people a reason to change. And part of that reason, of course, is understanding the why, and that's why two things: why go in this direction, and why move away from that lovely, comfortable place that we're at now. So we need to have both, and in order to move us. David, did you want to pick up on this one, or shall I take on?
I just pick out the work with the willing. You know, we've talked about the laggards and the early adopters in the stakeholder map. Working with the willing is certainly key to that. You know, coming back to the reference to Cotter early on, there's a video on YouTube you will find of Cotter when asked what to do if people won't engage with the change, is essentially saying don't bother. You're always going to get some people who will not engage, who you cannot bring on the journey with you. And in those cases, it's just, you know, cut them loose and move on with those that you can work with.
Yeah. That being said, I'll just counter that from my own experience, which is that some people that seem to be resistant, often resistance is not what you think it is. And I've definitely had cases where when somebody appears to be resistant, actually hearing them and actually having, you know, listening to them properly about what their reasons for resistance are, sometimes it can be surprising, and it can be surprising in a number of ways. One is they just needed to be heard. Maybe they've got lots of experience, and maybe they actually have something valuable that everyone else has missed. That's been the case in changes I've been involved in. And so sometimes by listening and by getting those kind of people involved a little bit more in the way the change is delivered can actually flip them from being, hugely negative to even in some cases being hugely positive and very supportive. So that can be true as well. And I think the key, and what Cotter's pointing at, is you have to kind of fairly quickly figure out the difference, because some people, frankly, as he said, it's not that they won't change ever, but it's going to be a hell of a job to get them to change, and you'll spend a lot of time on that. So it's a little bit of judgment that goes in.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dave.
I like the point that's come up from Sinead, and find out why people are resistant and take action to sell the benefits. And that's certainly very, very key. On any change initiative, everybody has a different change journey. They're coming from a different place and a different, reality to them. And, if you're going to overcome that resistance and to work with people, you need to understand what's happening in their world before you can start taking them on a change journey to where you want to go to. Yeah. And, talking to them and understanding and listening to what they're telling you and what they perceive as being the challenges, as Mark says, can quite often change you from being, seen as being resistant to actually being fully supportive.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was a great point here is, you don't always have the luxury of cutting certain people away from the change, or free, as the terminology was. So sometimes you kind of got no choice but to work with them. And sometimes those people can be hugely influential, for example, within the organization. That of course happens a lot, right? You get certain factors or certain parts of the organization that are just completely swimming in a different direction to everyone else. It's got to be addressed, of course, and that's a case where even more that you have to listen and use that as part of your way of trying to deliver and make the change in a way that gets them on board.
Okay, I'd like to come on Mark CL's comments here. Developing champions within the organisation to help swim the balance. Yes, I'm a big advocate of change agent networks within an organisation. I've had those in place when I've worked with large French automotive companies. I've had them in place when I've worked with National Grid, and having those champions that are recognised in the individual parts of the business as being, one of them, can really enhance your ability to bring people on that journey and to work with the impacted areas of the business. So developing champions, absolutely, definitely. Deploying them to support your organisation, either as part of your project team or part of the wider organisation, can both play huge benefits to actually getting the change across the line.
Yeah.
Give the questions you want to pick up on, Mark.
Allowing people to storm can be critical. Mary Barber, do you want to just give us a little bit more on that one? I think I know what you're saying, but just to clarify, make sure I've understood it correctly.
Yeah, so it's building on the point about you're always going to have people that disagree and people that agree. Often I've experienced, certainly in the public sector, because one of the difference between private and public sector is private sector, the senior team, the organisation knows where it's going, it sets the vision. Public sector, sometimes there isn't somebody that clearly sets a specific vision, and there can be multiple visions, some of which, or multiple views of the vision, some of which are just not compatible with each other. So a way to deal with that has been almost to take people through that team dynamics process and allowing people time and space to have a debate about what they believe to be true and what they believe the problem is they're trying to solve. And having both had an experience where we've done that and not done that, where we didn't do it, the consequence was we ended up with a major problem with the programme, because even a year in, not everybody was going in the right direction. It goes right back to one of your slides at the beginning, everybody marching in the same direction. And then the other, where we did do it, yes, it was a little bit noisy and painful for a short period of time, but what came through was the dynamics of the people who understood, believed, willing to commit, had skin in the game, and the people who were probably never really going to commit, and you were always going to have to drag them with you. So storming doesn't just allow you to get to the vision, it also allows you to identify where people's mindset is and where their worries are, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah, great points. And that lack of clarity of vision is more common than you'd think as well, where it ends up being a sort of set of objectives, as you say, some of them conflicting with each other, or at least perceived to conflict with each other within the group of people that we're trying to engage. And of course, the more ambiguous to make it, the less likely it is that people are going to, get on board. That's it. And my experience has been exactly the same. One of the things you'll look at, the companies that move the fastest and the changes that move the fastest, is a very, very clear pinpoint of kind of thing that's being reached to, and everybody gets it. Everybody
exactly. And it's particularly, I think, it's a comment there about the organisation has to change. In those situations, it's much easier to get people behind it, even if they're uncomfortable with it, because it's a must-do. Where it's certainly in policy, it's more tricky because people have different lenses on what the policy should be, or whether they even agree with it or not.
Yeah, or whether they see even a need to change. It's working very well as it is. Thanks very much. Yeah,
and return to office has been one of those for us, which is quite.
Yes, that's right. Yes, as we know, we've got every opinion on the spectrum on that one for sure.
Okay, there's one question here. As a student studying project management and starting a career in the field, what would you suggest I should focus on, and what should I learn more about to be a project manager in the future? I think in the context of this, don't forget that not only do you need to deliver your technical projects, but you also do need to deliver the change. I was brought up with training courses in an organisation called CEDEP in France, and they used an equation because we were all engineers, and they had to put it into the right wording for engineers. But it was basically the effectiveness of your project needs both the technical excellence of your delivery, but also the full engagement and adoption of your users. And without either of those, your project becomes worthless. So you need to focus on both of those aspects.
Yeah. And
I'm sure the APM would recommend many, many courses for you to develop your project management capability.
Yeah, and there's a whole branch of science, behavioural science, that is well worth digging into a little bit as well. If that's as you said, David, I think the thing I've found is that once you get the people side right, many of the other things tend to fall into place as well. Yeah, people will figure out a great way there if they actually buy the thing in the first place.
Okay, I'm just looking through the other questions. We've got one from Wendy Nicandrew. Do we have any examples of a good engagement plan and change strategy?
And this is where I think the danger is. It's trying to think that there's a one size fits all, and it's formulaic. There are of course principles, and we can point you at different places there. We can have maybe a chat offline depending on what your specific questions are. But the thing with all of this is when you've got people involved, it's not just a standard, a standard process. There's more principles really and guidance than a standard process.
Yeah, I would echo that as well, Mark. I've done change strategies inside several organisations, and it depends so much on the organisation that you're delivering it into what that looks like. If you're looking at training, whether it's a global organisation, and as I mentioned earlier, understanding the capability for training is key in that. So your overall strategy to deliver is so much dependent upon the individual change journeys or the change journeys of different parts of an organisation and their capability to deliver that change as anything else.
But going back to finish that off, there are definitely some fundamental principles around why we engage or disengage in change, and understanding those can be is absolutely critical to change success.
Okay, I've gone back earlier, so I found one from Alison Harmon, Mark. You talked earlier about minimising the emotional damage to those who feel dragged along in the change. Have you got any suggestions on how we might minimise emotional damage?
Yeah, and I think it gets back into understanding what that emotional damage is for them. In other words, what are their downsides that they perceive, And sometimes they're real downsides, right? You know, ultimately it can be that people are losing their jobs, which is very scary. Okay, I've actually been through that process of large organizations making a decision to close or whatever. I mean, one of them was in the music sector when I was involved in CD manufacturing. And as a result of Napster and various others, they closed a factory that I was part of. But if you handle it right, even that process, which is for many people the ultimate kind of thing that they're scared of, what we found is that is what people go to straight away the minute big change is announced, especially where it involves the word consolidation and things like that. People fear for their jobs, but you can make that process easier and less painful for people as well. So I'd say understand where they're at, and then work with them or with groups that are feeling the same way to understand what they see as the negative, and you know, find ways. There's always a way, right, to try and ease the damage, and that's unfortunately something that isn't often dealt with in a good way, and then people end up resentful and in all kinds of different negative emotions, as we've discussed earlier.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on one here from Chloe McAvoy. How do you measure progress of your change implementation in complex environments when multiple factors that you can't isolate, some of which can't be easily observed? Now, you know, once a few years ago, I was involved in a merger between a French company and an American company, and if you can imagine, and if you've ever read a book, When Cultures Collide, it's not a meeting of minds really in the middle, and the two cultures don't necessarily get on very, very well. But we had to integrate, we had to bring them into being a common team. And my role at the time was to work with the CEO to lead the integration of the executive teams across the world. And one of the tools that we did this to try and measure the progress of change and how it was going was that each one of these management sessions that we did, we asked the executive team in that particular region, in that particular business, to describe the state of the integration and the state of the company at that time as an imaginary animal, and to actually draw it out. And what we saw was that at the start of the integration, very, very early days post-merger, you know, the pictures were animals, blood pouring out of holes, biting each other's heads off, you know, very, very, very violent images. And over the 2-year period, when we were running this integration, gradually over time, we could see at each of these sessions that the animals became much more placid, much more useful, much more forward focused towards generating money for the future. So it's coming back to a point that we mentioned earlier about telling stories and being able to articulate stories and to use physical ways of demonstrating the status of a change and to bring people together. But that was a good way of actually measuring progress of change. And we ended up publishing the book afterwards. Thank you very much for your participation. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, and do feel free from my side. Thank you all for a great engagement today. And do feel free to reach out. You know, I'm on LinkedIn. If you've got any other further questions or you'd like to go deeper on the topic, I'm more than happy to do that as well. And I'm sure you're the same, David.
Absolutely. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a great day.